Hey everybody, it's Evan from Method at getmethod.com, and today we're going to be doing the next video in the series for Maxwell Render for Bonzai3d. And we're going to be discussing several different strategies for exterior lighting using the Maxwell Render plugin inside of Bonzai. We're going to cover physical sky, sky dome, and IBL, which is also known as image-based lighting, and we're going to talk about how to get proper exposure in an image inside of Maxwell Render because it does mimic a real-world camera. Alright, so let's jump in and get started. Alright, so here we have a 3D model of an exterior of a building inside of Bonzai3d. And all the materials have already been applied to this model, and I've set up a few views that I'm going to want to render. And so what I'm going to do here is jump to the view that we're going to work with for this tutorial, and I'll pretty much leave it here the whole time. One thing that I like to do before I do any rendering inside of, or any final rendering inside of Maxwell and Bonzai, is to set up my image options to get the resolution that I want for my final renderings. So you can go ahead and plug in whatever numbers you want here. Obviously bigger numbers are higher resolution. You know, you might go up to 2500, which will give you a nice resolution image at 11 by 17, give you about 300 pixels per inch. For this tutorial, I'm just going to go ahead and keep it at 1600 so that the renderings happen a little bit faster. Obviously, the bigger you go, the longer it takes, so something to think about when you're setting up your scenes. And so what we're going to do here is first talk about the physical sky. And physical sky is a light type, so in your Bonzai tool palette over here, we have our light section, and by default every scene comes with an ambient light and a sunlight. And the ambient light provides kind of an overall light, and you'll see that turning those off didn't make any effect because I'm only in the shaded work mode. I'm going to go ahead and switch over here to shaded full display, and you can see now that my scene is completely dark because I've turned off all the lights. So ambient light just gives us kind of a bounce light or a fill light, and you can control the intensity of that there by double clicking on that light and going in and changing the brightness. And then we have sunlight by default, which is in the scene, and you can have it either cast shadows or not by clicking this little box. And what this does is, the nice thing about using shaded full mode up here is that it gives you an accurate representation of where the shadows are going to land on the building. And so what I'm going to do here is actually just add a new light. So hit the little plus sign, and I'm not going to name it or anything. I'm just going to double click that, and instead of choosing a typical type light, you'll see that now that we have Maxwell plug-in running inside of Bonzai, we have these additional types. We have Ies Lights, which are for interiors. Those are using special types of profiles to define what the light looks like. So those don't apply to exterior rendering. Same for softbox. Those are typically used for interior rendering. That is a Maxwell light as well. Then we have Sky Dome, Physical Sky, and IBL, and these three are all going to be used for exterior lighting. And first we're going to start off with Physical Sky. And by just choosing that type, you see now it's set to be a Maxwell type of a light. And we have 4 different tabs inside the interface. So every physical sky inside of Maxwell has settings, and you can load different physical skies by clicking on this box right here. And when you go into your plugins Maxwell Skies folder, which is in your applications folder, it comes with a few different presets. Okay, so by default it's just set up with a typical kind of sunny day. If you do decide to change these settings, it will change the effect of the sky and will probably give you some otherworldly effects. So we can also set our location. There are several ways to set location. We can go by origin and center of interest, which is basically us moving the light around. We can set the azimuth and altitude, and we can also go by site and time. We can look at a shadows tab, but you'll notice that anytime we're using an actual Maxwell physical sky light, shadows are going to be on because Maxwell only does real world calculations, and in the real world you can't have a light without shadows, so there's no options there. And then parameters, this is where you can control all the different parameters of the atmosphere that go along with this light, and we'll talk more about those in a little bit. Okay, so I'm just gonna go ahead and click OK here, and you'll notice now that I can turn off my sunlight, turn off its shadows, but you'll see that my new light is also casting shadows. So this physical sky gets a little PS icon, so I know it's a physical sky, and it is shining and the lights are on. Ambient also works here, but these do not get taken into account when the actual Maxwell render happens. Okay, so let's fire off a render here by clicking on the Maxwell Render icon, and I'm going to hold my mouse over that for a second just to look at what's going on inside our render options real quick. Like I said before, you kind of want to set up your time limit. I usually set the time limit really high. You know, this could be 10,000. And our sampling level, max it out at 16. I'm going to drop that down to 12. And I'm going to go through my different tabs here real quick. I only want to show the render. I don't want to keep any of the other channels. My camera is set up to be at the f-stop of 8 and a shutter speed of 200. Sensitivity, or the ISO, is at 100. And this is kind of typical settings that ship with the Maxwell plugin for a normal daylight rendering. I'm just going to go ahead and leave those. It should give us a pretty nice image right from the beginning. I'm not going to mess with Simulens. The file, let's do image only so that we don't write out all the extra file folder stuff that comes with a Maxwell render, the MXI and the MXS and all that kind of stuff. I'm just interested in the image right now. And then that's it. Okay, so I'm going to close that and I'm going to hit go. And it's going to translate this into a Maxwell Render file, and it's going to open up Maxwell Render and start rendering our image. Okay, so now our image is rendering, and I'm going to zoom out a little bit here so we can see the whole thing. And you can see down here in the preview that the exposure, just by default, is set up in a pretty decent way. So I know it's going to look pretty good, and I can tweak it a little bit once we're done, but I can let it go. And you can also see that the Maxwell sky is a nice bright blue, kind of sunny Southern California sky, and it's going to just continue to refine this image. Alright, so the shadows you can see are an exact representation of what we saw in the shaded full mode inside of Bonzai, so that's a nice easy way to set up the direction of our light. And otherwise all the materials and everything are rendering exactly like I set them up inside of Bonzai. Okay, so here we are back in Bonzai, and what I've done is I've added a few more physical skies. And I like to just keep adding physical skies rather than modifying the ones that I have. If you want to get different looks out of your model using Maxwell. And you can see here that we can just simply switch between any light that we have. And so what I did was I loaded up some different presets that come with the Maxwell Render plugin. So I'm going to show you how to assign a preset to a light. So once you create a light, you can go in here and you can click on this folder icon, and that takes you into your Maxwell Skies folder inside the plugin. And you can see that it comes with 7 different possible presets that you can load in. Now if we jump over to the web real quick, if you go to resources.maxwellrender.com, you can look at different skies on this website that other people have uploaded and come up with formulas for. And if I jump over here to the visual catalog, you can see there's 3 different pages full of possible sky presets that you can now load into the plugin. So if you want to download a particular sky file, this is a good place to look for some different options. So if you want something with a really cool looking sun, or if you want something that's more of like a sunset or an early morning, or there's a lot of different presets here. So let's jump back to Bonzai. And in this case, what I've done is I've loaded up the San Francisco fog sky file. And in here, the power, temperature, reflectance, and parameters are different from the one that we loaded up just by default. So you'll see the values are going to be different, and that's really what makes these different looks possible for these exterior renderings, is that the atmosphere, the moisture content, and the dust, and all the things that make up the atmosphere are different for these different presets. Okay, so if we look at the San Francisco fog one, what we've done, let's go ahead and fire off a render on this one. Alright, so here it goes inside of Maxwell. And you can see just by looking at the preview down here that the sky is a lot lighter because of the fog. We also don't have as sharp of shadows because there's so much light bounce happening. And overall we just have a kind of a softer look to the image. We don't have that bright sunny day with the sharp shadows. Alright, so let's look at another one here. I've loaded up a third one, which is the bright day. And the preset for this one is this blue clear dark horizon. And this one again has completely different settings. And let's go ahead and launch a render on this one and see what the difference looks like here for this type of a sky. Okay, so here's this one inside of Maxwell Render, and here you can see again we have quite a bit of a different look from the previous one. And so back in Bonzai now we can just continue to toggle between these and get completely different looks out of the same model. We never have to save as a completely separate model. It's a really nice workflow. Okay, so now that you've learned how to load up a sky, let's look at how to control the lighting. Alright, so if we go into this one that we currently have active, you'll see that obviously the sun's turned on. And you don't want to play with these numbers. They really are tied to the look and the atmosphere that's happening here. If you tweak them, you probably want to save as a separate sky file, and you can do that by clicking this little save button right here. It will allow you to save the sky file. And so if you do tweak the parameters and you come up with something you like, you might want to do that to use again at a later time. Let's go ahead and look at how to set the shadow and the light location. Okay, so you can see we get this little diagram here when we're under the site time option for location. And so let's go over this one first. So if you look at this diagram, you can see here that our site is basically, if you think about this little dot in the middle as being a vertical element, and we're looking straight down in like a site plan kind of an orientation, you can see here that the sun is off to the east. And our building, if it were here in the middle, it's almost directly east. So you can see we're getting kind of a long shadow. And if we look over here at our building, you can see that, yeah, we're getting that nice long shadow because this side of the building is facing south. Okay, so what we're going to do is just tweak this a little bit so you can see kind of how this updates the light. All right, so right now we're in June. Okay, so if let's go to November. And if you want a very specific day, you can just type it in right here by editing that. So if I type in November 30th and hit tab, you don't want to necessarily hit OK. You can see how that automatically enters it. I could go to October 12th and I could type a different format in, 10-12, and you can see it knows what you're thinking. So you can type in just about any format you can think of to do this. All right, so let's go ahead and tweak this here, and then let's set the time and change this up a little bit. For some reason my site rotation is off here. There we go. Okay, so you can see that as we go through the time of the day, the sun is coming around the building on its south side, and the shadows get longer in the evening. They're pretty short during the day, and they're longer in the morning. So if I want short shadows during the day, I can go ahead and choose a time like that and go ahead and click OK, and you'll see that the light position automatically updates. The other thing that you can do instead of setting this up by hand is you can hit the select button and you can choose a city and a site based on country here. So if you're working in Canada, you could pick something out. If you're working in the United States, you can just scroll down to that area and find something that's close to you. And so you could choose something, you know, like if I wanted to choose Los Angeles here, for instance, I could choose that. And the other thing that you could do is you can plug in the latitude and longitude for your city based on those numbers if you know what they are. So lots of cities to choose from that are already in the database here, and just find something that's, again, close to where your site is. Now another way to change the lighting is just to move it just like any other object. And to do that inside of Bonzai, I actually like to use multi-view, which is under the window pull down menu. And let's go ahead and switch this to just display a little bit quicker here. Alright, so here's my top view, here's my front view, and here's my side view. And so you want to first click in the window to activate it and then move it around. So you can orbit in these views. It's a little bit weird. If you accidentally kind of orbit in that view, it does get rid of that view, so you might want to go back up here and go to the side view. You can always go back to where you were. And here's your camera view. So what I'm going to do is activate my top view. I'm going to go ahead and turn on the visibility, and I'm going to unlock my new light that I started to play with right here. Okay, and in this view I'm going to go to shaded, so I can see those shaded full, so I can see those shadows. So here's my light, and you can see it's kind of a tiny little thing right here. So I'm going to use my move tool, and I'm just going to grab it and move it up. And then here in my side view, I'm just going to pull the source of the light out, so you can see how that's affecting my shadows. And so maybe in the top view, again, this is why I like to use multi-view, is because I like to get where I can see the results in real time. So you can see now as the light is in the afternoon, it would be over here, and you can see I can get that real-time result. And if I wanted to go to like a morning, I can pull the light over to this side and get an early morning. Okay, so let's go over here and let's go to like let's call it like a golden hour kind of a look, which is in the afternoon when the sun's nice and warm and kind of at a low angle and lighting the face of the building in a nice way. And so if I go into this view, I can, I can get my shadows higher or lower. You don't want to get below the horizon, but let's say that looks pretty good right there. Okay, so again, activate the perspective view and turn off multi-view. If you don't activate that perspective view, it's going to go out in whatever view you selected. Okay, so I always make sure you select the view you want to go out in back to a single viewport. Okay, so now I've got these nice golden hour shadows, and so what I want to do is fire off this render so that we can talk about setting the right exposure. All right, so I'm just going to go ahead, and this time before I render this, instead of just rendering the image only, I'm going to go back to automatic so that it saves all of my MXI, my Maxwell files, so that I can have the most dynamic range when I want to tweak this image after the fact. So I'm going to hit render and let this thing go for a while. And once Maxwell starts, we'll kind of get an idea of what kind of settings we're going to need to change by looking at the preview. Okay, so now we can see that our image is rendering here inside of Maxwell, and we have our little preview, and you can see that the image is a little bit underexposed. So that's not a big deal in Maxwell because it is such a high dynamic range to the image. We can adjust the exposure during the rendering process or after the rendering process using the sliders here inside of Maxwell. And we could also set them up ahead of time if we know kind of what we're after inside of Bonzai. All right, so if we go up here to our edit window, you can see that we have an ISO and a shutter speed right here. And we can go ahead and tweak this, and you can see how it's kind of tweaking the preview down here as I play with the shutter speed. So I can bring the exposure down, I can bring the exposure up. So depending on the look that you're after, you can adjust that setting, and then when it gets to the next sampling level, you can see it's going to hit that in about 30 seconds. It will automatically adjust the rendering to match those new settings that we can see in the preview. So as soon as it hits that next sampling level, you're going to notice that the image is going to kind of pop into place with the new settings. So you can continue to kind of tweak this throughout the rendering process and get what you like. Or when the rendering's done, you can go ahead and do it after the fact and update the image and then save that image out. So I'm going to just let this get to the next sampling level, and you kind of see it tweak a little bit. Alright, and now let's go ahead and just stop this. So I don't want to wait too long here for the next one, so let's let it finish writing the file. And then let's go ahead and just save our image out right here. So we'll save it to our desktop and just call this library sunny golden hour. Okay, and we'll save it as a PNG file at 8. Exposure is an important topic in Maxwell, so let's get a little more in depth before continuing. So when Maxwell renders, it's making an extremely high dynamic range image of your project. And this image is stored in an MXI or Maxwell image file. This image describes the complete distribution of real light intensities in the scene. When it comes time to make a common image like a TIFF or a JPEG, this high dynamic range must be mapped to the much narrower dynamic range on the computer screen. This is the equivalent of taking a picture of a real-world scene, except Maxwell uses a virtual camera to make an image of the HDRI. So basically, when it's rendering much more value than you can actually see, and so when you actually save that image out, it just makes an image based on that. So if we go into our Maxwell Render options, let's go ahead and look at our camera settings. So the controls for exposing this virtual picture are exactly like a real camera, except they are much more forgiving. They include shutter speed, and this is the duration for which the virtual sensor is exposed to light, measured as a fraction of a second. So a value of 2 here means half a second. So if we go ahead and type that in, 2, that means we have a half a second shutter, which is a pretty long shutter. All right. Basically, slower shutter speeds let light hit the sensor for a longer period of time, and so you result in a lighter image. So if you're rendering animations with moving objects or cameras, using a slower shutter speed will also result in more motion blur, but this isn't really a concern in Bonzai because animation isn't supported at this time. So if you wanted to go with a faster shutter speed, you can go ahead and type that number up really high, so 1/1000th of a second. Right? So this is higher numbers to the right, lower numbers to the left. 1/1000th of a second would be a really fast shutter speed on a typical camera. So the next one that we're going to talk about here is f-stop. And f-stop is the size of the aperture of the virtual camera. So the bigger the aperture, the more light reaches the sensor and the lighter the image will be. F-stops are expressed as the denominator of a fraction, so smaller numbers represent larger apertures, and larger numbers represent smaller apertures. In practical terms, sliding the slider to the left results in more light, and sliding it to the right is less light. The f-stop setting also controls the depth of field in your image, which is the amount of your image that's in focus. Sliding the slider to the right will result in a deeper focus, that is, more areas will be in focus. The camera focus is controlled by the location of the view's center of interest. So let's take a look at the cone of vision so I can show you about that center of interest. So if you go into the View pull-down menu to Edit Cone of Vision, this takes you into a quad view of your project, and what you can do is edit the position of the camera only. You can't manipulate geometry. You do have to activate each view that you want to work within before you start editing the camera position. But what you can do in here is you can see that we have our camera rig, and let me zoom out just to kind of move it off to the side so you can see it here. So here's our camera. This little dot here represents our point of view, or where we're standing in the scene. And this arrowhead here is the center of interest, and you can move that around, and it can be far away from the camera or close to the camera. But that is what I'm referring to. That's what sets up depth of field. That's your focal point. So these other clipping planes here aren't going to really affect anything in the view. So if I move this back over so that I'm looking at the project and I zoom in a little bit closer here, and let's go down to this view and move our camera up in space. Okay, so now that I'm a little bit closer to my scene, again, you want to get really close and set your focal point on what you want to focus on, and then you can start to play with those two sliders to get depth of field. ISO is the next one we're going to talk about, which is the sensitivity of the sensor on the camera. Higher values make more sensitivity. In a real camera, a higher ISO will result in more noise or grain. However, this isn't a case in Maxwell, so there's no drawbacks to adjusting this setting. A practical approach to image exposure is to simply park the ISO on 400 and then adjust your f-stop based on the approximate depth of field you want in your image. Then do a test rendering as we did a moment ago to interactively determine the shutter speed. So if we wanted more depth of field, we can go ahead and crank this up a little bit higher and then do a test render. And then once we see the preview, we can start to play with the shutter speed. Okay, so once we're back inside Maxwell Render, we can see that the image is slightly underexposed, but it is using the settings that we set up. We have an ISO of 400. It took that right out of the Bonzai plug-in dialog box, and our shutter speed is at 200. So now we can start to play with the shutter speed. So remember, slower shutter speed means more light. So as we go down with the shutter speed slider, the image gets brighter. Okay, and then when it gets to the next sampling level, we'll see it pop into place. All right, so once you find the shutter speed that you kind of like, you know, maybe 50, let's go ahead and just copy this value, and we can stop this image from rendering. And we'll jump back into Bonzai, and let's just paste that into the settings for Maxwell Render. Okay, so 50. So now we know every time that we render this image out, we're not going to have to adjust that anymore. If you find that you want more or less depth of field, you don't have to start over from scratch. You can enable the EV lock and then adjust the f-stop and shutter speed will update such that the overall exposure remains the same. You can see how those sliders work together to maintain the exposure. One thing you need to understand is that the depth of field is dependent on how close your subject is to the camera. If you have a small subject like a tabletop setup, the effect will be much more pronounced than with a larger scene such as an entire building like this one, because you're likely to have the camera focus much closer. So if you model things like jewelry or things that sit in the palm of your hand, it's much easier to get depth of field because the camera is focused so closely to an object, whereas in a scene like this, it's sharp all the way around because it's so far away from the camera. It's much harder to get depth of field in an image like this. All right, so the other kind of light that we want to look at next is the sky dome light. And so I'm going to go ahead and just label this so we know what it is. Double click on it, open it up, and we're going to choose Sky Dome. And basically the sky dome light is a stripped down version of a physical sky, so it renders a little bit faster. And you can set the sky dome colors at the zenith and the horizon, and you can position the sun the same way you did with a physical sky. We have the exact same settings here. You'll also notice that there are no atmosphere controls in this one. So let's go ahead and set that one up and hit render and see what that looks like. Okay, so a couple notes about skies. I just want to reiterate here that you can have as many physical skies and sky dome lights in your project as you want. So you could have some for the morning, some for the evening, different atmospheres, whatever you want to do. However, only one will be active at a time. You'll notice that when I click on any of the other ones, any of our other Maxwell lights automatically shut off. All right, and the other thing about each one of these different skies is that they don't support clouds at this time. They're always a clear sky, and so for that you're going to need to use an image-based light, which we'll discuss next. So let's add a new light. Double click and choose IBL for image-based light. And you'll see that there's two different options here. We can do simple or detailed. Chances are you won't have to use the detailed, but you can add different IBLs for these different channels if you want to. You can see you can load a different HDRI image into each one of those. I'm just going to use the simple one for now, and let's go ahead and load up one of these images. So applications, it's going to be in my Maxwell folder, and I'm going to go into HDRI, and here's a bunch of different ones that we can use. And if you click on these here, it gives you a preview, and they take a little bit of time because my computer's doing so much, but you can see here how we actually have some different things going on in the sky beyond just a gradient. So I'm going to go ahead and choose this file here, open it up, and so that loads it in. You can see that we have several different checkboxes here, and what we're going to do is we're going to use IBL Light and render it out and see what it looks like. So let's turn off the sky dome, and let's turn on the IBL light and hit render. Okay, so because that image was so dark, at least where the building was, the sky looked perfect. But what we're going to do is we're going to double click on that IBL light, and you can see that we have different sliders here where we can adjust the compensation for background intensity, illumination intensity, reflection. I'm going to up the illumination intensity to 3. You don't want to go real big numbers or else it'll really blow out the image. And then I'm going to go ahead and launch another Maxwell render, and we'll be able to compare the difference here. Again, you want to do it that way and not adjust the shutter speed or the ISO in Maxwell Render, because that will just overexpose the entire image, even the sky in the background. What we want to be able to do is just control the illumination of the geometry at this point. Alright, so once the preview here shows up, we'll kind of see what this is looking like. Alright, so our building looks a lot better now. And again, we can still tweak ISO to raise the exposure of the image, but we're getting an overall better illumination on the building. You can see here, if I were to lower the shutter speed or increase the ISO too much, the whole image would burn out and go white, including the sky. So by increasing the intensity of the illumination of the HDR, we're getting a much better result because we still get the nice sky, but we also get our geometry illuminated correctly. So after I tweak those again, when it gets to the next SL, it will pop into the right exposure based on those slider settings. Alright, and we'll take a look at this render when it's done. You can now see how the geometry of the building is lit up and it's in a good exposure balance with the background HDRI. So adjusting the intensity of the HDRI illuminance is the way to go with this kind of a setup. Okay, so now we're going to show you how to use a background channel to provide a cloudy background for the physical sky that we set up earlier. So let's go with our bright day sky for our physical sky, but we also want our IBL light on here to provide just the background. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just uncheck these other 3 checkboxes so that the IBL is strictly used as a background image. Now I also could have it be in the reflections. I guess I'll go ahead and leave that one on just because I want to maybe see some of that in the glass if it's going to show up. You could also use a sky dome if you don't want to use a physical light. Again, that will render a little bit faster, but remember it's one at a time. So you can use 2 in combination if you're using an IBL and a physical sky, or an IBL and a sky dome, but you can't have more than one physical sky or sky dome on or active at one time. Alright, so again, let's go ahead and use both of these now together and launch another Maxwell render, and this time we're going to get both in the combination. Okay, so here it is in Maxwell where we have an IBL for the background and we have our physical sky for the foreground elements, and you can see that that background is pretty dark, and there's no way right inside of Maxwell Render to adjust that background image separately. So I'm going to go ahead and stop that and jump back to Bonzai and jump into the IBL light and adjust the intensity. Okay, so now you can see that as it renders here, that our sky is much better lit in conjunction with the physical sky that is lighting the building. And so again, if we adjust the ISO and the shutter speed up here, you're going to get the preview to render how you want it to, and then let it continue rendering. You can see in this final image that the HDRI and the foreground building elements are all balanced really nicely as far as the lighting is concerned. So again, we're just using the HDRI as a background image for our physical sky, which is providing all the lighting. Depending on the angle that you have your camera set up and with the reflective objects on your model, you would catch that HDRI image in the reflections as long as you have that check mark next to the box to provide reflections via the HDRI. And again, you can adjust the intensity of that within the Maxwell dialog box. Alright, so that is it for exterior lighting and rendering in Maxwell Render for Bonzai. You can see it's really easy to use, and it gives you some really great results. You have tons of different options to get the look that you're after, and it always is going to look like a real world image. A couple things I wanted to just point out real quick at the end there is that you can have as many of these renderings running at the same time as your computer can handle. So right there I think I had 4 different renderings running, but if you have a quad core or an 8-core machine, you can go ahead and just queue them all up, let them all go, and then leave the computer running all night if you go ahead and set that time limit nice and high, and then in the morning you're going to come back to some really nice looking images. The other thing is that with those HDRI images, if you don't know much about HDRI, it's actually using the light values from the image to cast rays onto your model. So that's why if you use an overcast HDRI, you're going to get an overcast looking rendering. And if you have a bright sunny HDRI, you're going to get some really nice bright images out of that. So depending on the HDRI you choose, you're going to get a completely different look, just like you get a completely different look when you choose a different physical sky. The only difference is you are going to get that image in the background as well. All right. So in the next method cast, we're going to talk about interior rendering, and that's going to give us the opportunity to talk about Ies lights and those softbox lights that I talked about in the light palette. It's also going to give us the chance to talk about the multi-light feature, which is an amazing technology built into Maxwell Render, where we can individually control the intensity of every light in our scene after the render is done. So you can literally do a single render and get 20 different renderings out of it when all is said and done by adjusting the lighting after the fact. I'm really looking forward to it. So I hope you are too. I'll see you on the next method cast. Bye.